The paper shook in Naomi Kendrick's hands. Not because the afternoon wind had kicked up through the open door of the marshal's office, though it had. Not because the wood stove in the corner had gone cold, though the chill in the room was real enough to raise the hair on her arms. The paper shook because the name printed beneath her own on the land deed was one she recognized with every fiber of her being, and the recognition of it felt like a blade being drawn slowly across the most tender part of her chest. Gerald Holt, the man she had buried 8 months ago. The man who had come to her in Abilene with kind eyes and a silver tongue and a promise of land out west, land she could call her own after a lifetime of calling nothing her own. The man she had agreed to marry, not out of love, but out of the desperate and bone-deep need to stop running from a poverty that had chased her since the day her father drank away their Kansas farm. The man who, it turned out, had never been Gerald Holt at all. The man who, it turned out, had put a second name on the deed she was only now seeing for the first time. The name beneath hers and Gerald's was not a stranger's name. It was Eli Dawson. Naomi looked up from the paper. Her eyes found the man standing behind the marshal's desk, the one who had handed her the deed with steady hands and careful eyes. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble, and the kind of quiet authority that did not need a badge to announce itself, though he wore one on his chest. The star caught the afternoon light filtering through the dusty window. Marshal Eli Dawson looked at her face, and what he saw there made him reach behind him without a word, pull out the wooden chair, and sit down. Not because he was tired, not because the conversation had become casual. He sat down because in his years of carrying a badge across the territory of New Mexico, he had learned to recognize the exact moment when a person's world collapsed beneath them, and sitting down was the only thing that kept a situation from tumbling into something irreversible. He needed to be at her level. He needed to be present, not towering. He needed her to understand, before she said the terrible thing she was clearly about to say, that he was not her enemy. "That name," Naomi said, and her voice was barely a sound, barely more than breath shaped into syllables. "That is your name." "Yes," Eli said. "You were on Gerald's deed." "It is more complicated than that," he said carefully. "He is dead," she said, and the word came out flat and absolute, like a stone dropped onto hardwood. "I watched them put him in the ground in October of last year. I stood over the grave myself." "I know," Eli said. She set the paper down on the edge of the desk with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that if she did not set it down gently, she was going to do something she would regret. Her brown eyes were bright with a fury that had not decided yet whether it was going to become grief or rage. "Then you are going to explain to me," she said, "every single word of what that name means, and you are going to start from the beginning." Eli Dawson looked at Naomi Kendrick across the width of his own desk in his own office in the small and sun-cracked town of Redrock, New Mexico, in the spring of 1883, and he understood that the next words out of his mouth were going to determine the entire course of what came after. He had known this moment was coming since the morning he received the telegram from the land office in Santa Fe telling him that a widow had arrived to claim the Holt parcel. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had arranged the words in his mind like a man, arranging cartridges in a belt. And now that she was here, with her dark hair pinned up and her traveling dress still dusty from the stage and her jaw set with that particular ferocity that told him she was a woman who had already survived a great many things the world had thrown at her, every rehearsed sentence dissolved like sugar in rain. He took a breath. "The man you married," he said, "was not Gerald Holt." She did not flinch. "I know that now. The real Gerald Holt died in a mine collapsed near Albuquerque in 1879. I spoke with the land office clerk before I came here. The man I married was using Gerald's name and Gerald's deed and Gerald's reputation." Eli nodded slowly. "His real name was Cole Merritt." Something crossed her face then, a flicker, just a flicker, but he caught it. "Cole Merritt," she repeated. "He was a land swindler," Eli said. He found widows and women of means traveling west, married them, used their names on land filings to double-claim parcels he had no right to, then walked away with whatever money he could carry. He did it in Colorado. He did it in Arizona. He came to New Mexico in 1882 and found the Holt parcel, which was legitimate unclaimed land, and he layered 3 separate names onto the deed to make the filing appear ironclad. 3 names, Naomi said. Yours, his, and mine. The silence that fell between them was the kind that had weight to it, the kind a person could trip over if they were not careful. Why yours? She asked. Eli Dawson clasped his hands together on the desk in front of him. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles in the way that told a story he had never intended to tell anyone at a first meeting. He looked at those hands for a moment, because looking at her was harder than he had expected. Then he looked up. Because Cole Merritt was my brother, he said. It had taken Naomi Kendrick the better part of a year to get from Abilene to Redrock, New Mexico, and the journey had been one of the harder ones of her 27 years of living. She had been born in 1856 in Lawrence, Kansas, the second daughter of Thomas Kendrick, a man who could charm a room and not hold a dollar, and Margaret Kendrick, a woman who held the family together with the kind of quiet, grinding endurance that does not get written down in history books, but keeps the world from falling apart. Thomas Kendrick had lost the family farm to gambling debts in 1871, when Naomi was 15. Margaret Kendrick had died of fever 2 years later, in a boarding house in Topeka, holding Naomi's hand and telling her to be braver than the circumstances. Naomi had tried. She had worked as a seamstress in Topeka for 3 years. She had saved every cent she could spare. She had watched her older sister Clara marry a merchant and disappear into the kind of respectable life that required never speaking again about where you came from. She had not begrudged Clara the disappearance, but she had understood it as a warning. Respectability, in 1878, cost more than Naomi had. Survival, however, was free if you were willing to work for it. She had moved to Abilene in 1880, following word of work in a dress shop owned by a widow named Mrs. Farnham who paid fairly and asked few questions. She had lived in a small rented room above the shop for 2 years, sewing other women's wedding dresses and Sunday clothes, banking what she could against the day she might have land of her own. Land was the only currency she had ever trusted. Land did not drink. Land did not gamble. Land stayed. Gerald Holt had walked into Mrs. Farnham's shop in August of 1882, wanting a new waistcoat made. He had been charming in that effortless way that Naomi recognized and distrusted even as she found herself charmed by it. He had talked about New Mexico with the kind of specific, detailed love that made her believe he had actually been there. He had talked about a parcel of land with a creek running through it and good grazing grass and soil that grew corn without too much argument. He had talked about building something real. He had asked her to marry him 6 weeks after they met. She had said yes, not because she loved him, though she had been warming to the idea of it. She had said yes because the land was real and the deed was in front of her, and the notary had stamped it, and she had believed, for the first time in a long time, that the ground was not about to shift beneath her feet. They had married in September of 1882 in front of a justice of the peace in Abilene, with Mrs. Farnham and a young clerk named Theodore as witnesses. Gerald Holt had been a fine-looking man. He had kissed her hand when the ceremony was over and told her she was going to love New Mexico. He was dead 6 weeks after the wedding. A horse had thrown him on the road outside of Dodge City while they were traveling west. Or that was what the men who found him said. The men who found him were strangers. There had been no one there who knew him, and Naomi had been inside the stage when it happened. She had heard the commotion and climbed out to find her husband of 6 weeks lying in the road with his neck broken. She had buried him in Dodge City. She had sat in a room in the Dodge City Hotel for 4 days, trying to understand what she was going to do. She had his deed. She had her own name on it. She had decided that the land was still hers because her name was still on it, and because she had nothing else. It had taken her the rest of the fall to get her affairs arranged, to get the travel money together, to write to the land office in Santa Fe. The letter she received back from the land office had been polite but confusing, mentioning irregularities in the filing that required her personal presence to resolve. She had not known what that meant. She had spent the winter in Dodge City working as a seamstress again, saving enough for the stage fare south. In March of 1883, she had started the journey to Redrock. The land office clerk in Santa Fe had given her the first real information. The name Gerald Holt was associated with a man killed in a mine collapse in 1879. The land filing had been submitted in 1882. The dates did not match. Someone had used Gerald Holt's name fraudulently. The land itself was still legitimate, still unoccupied, but the filing was tangled with 3 names, and one of those names belonged to the marshal in Redrock, and the marshal in Redrock was going to need to be consulted. Naomi had not known what to expect when she climbed off the stage in Redrock. She had not expected the marshal to look like Eli Dawson. She had not expected him to have those quiet, careful eyes, or the hands of a man who had built things and broken things in roughly equal measure. She had not expected to walk into his office with the deed in her hand, and have him hand her a copy of a deed with his own name on it, as though it were both the most natural and most complicated thing in the world. She had not expected to feel, in the middle of her fury, the faint and inconvenient awareness that this man was affecting her in a way she was not remotely prepared for. She pushed that awareness down hard, the way she pushed down most things that threatened to make her less than entirely practical. "Your brother," she said flatly, across the width of Eli Dawson's desk. "My half-brother," he said. "Same father, different mothers. I did not grow up with Cole. My father had a first family before mine. I met Cole for the first time when I was 22. He was 25. He was already running his schemes by then." Eli paused. "I tried to reach him. I tried to get him to stop. He was not a man who could be stopped by trying. And yet your name is on my deed." "Cole put my name on the deed without my knowledge," Eli said. "He did it, I believe, because he thought having a lawman's name on the filing would make it harder to challenge. It was a kind of insurance against scrutiny. If anyone questioned the deed, the presence of the local marshal's name on it would give the whole thing an air of legitimacy." His jaw tightened. "I only discovered it 2 months ago when the land office wrote to me directly." Naomi stood very still. Outside, through the open door, Redrock went about its afternoon business. A horse clomped past on the main street. Somewhere down the way a door banged. The smell of dust and horse and distant cook smoke drifted in on the warm air. "He used me," she said. "Yes," Eli said. There was no softening of it, no gentling. She had not asked for gentling, and he understood that. "He married me for my name on that filing." "Yes. And then he died." She paused. "Or someone killed him." The quality of the silence between them changed. Eli looked at her with a new attention. "You think he was killed?" "I think a horse threw him 6 weeks after our wedding," she said carefully, "on a road he had supposedly traveled many times. I think the men who found him were already there when I climbed out of the stage. I think they did not seem surprised. I think I was too raw and too frightened at the time to say any of that out loud." She met his eyes. "I am saying it out loud now." Eli Dawson got up from the chair. He moved around the desk to the cabinet on the far wall and took out a second folder, thicker than the first, and set it on the desk between them. "Cole Merritt had enemies," he said. "A man who does what he did accumulates them. There is a man named Aldous Crane who lost a ranch in Colorado to one of Cole's schemes. Crane has been following Cole's trail for 2 years. I have been trying to track Crane down since I learned about the deed." Naomi looked at the folder. "You have been investigating this?" "Since the day I found out my name was on this deed, yes." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Because my name is on that deed without my consent, which means I have a stake in resolving this cleanly. And because whatever Cole did to you was done partly using my name, and that is something I intend to make right." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down herself. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you know about Aldous Crane." Redrock, New Mexico, in the spring of 1883 was a town that had not quite decided what it wanted to be. It had the bones of permanence: a proper main street with a general store and a hotel, and a livery stable and a barber shop, and a saloon that doubled as a gathering hall, a small church at the north end of town, a land office that was really just a room attached to the assessor's office. But it had the restlessness of a place that knew the railroad was coming, and had not yet learned whether that was salvation or destruction. The population ran to about 300 souls, a mix of long-settled Mexican families whose land grants predated the American acquisition of the territory, Anglo ranchers who had arrived in the 1870s with their eyes on grass and water, miners who came and went with the seasons, a few Navajo families who moved between the town and their traditional lands to the west, and the usual contingent of drifters, gamblers, and people whose history was better left unasked about. Eli Dawson had been the marshal here for 4 years. He had taken the job when the previous marshal, a man named Torrey, had retired to Albuquerque after taking a bullet in the knee that had not been fatal but had been definitive. Eli had come from Lincoln County, where he had served as a deputy during some of the most violent years the territory had seen. He had learned things in Lincoln County about the way violence started and the way it could be, not always but sometimes, redirected. He had learned things about his own capacity for it that he kept private. He had come to Redrock wanting something quieter, and Redrock had mostly obliged him. Mostly. He showed Naomi the file he had compiled on Aldous Crane. Crane was 51 years old, originally from Missouri, a man who had built a cattle operation in Colorado through a combination of genuine hard work and sharp dealing that had been ruthless but not quite illegal, not until Cole Merritt came along and outsharped him. Cole had manipulated a land filing in Pueblo County that had left Crane holding a deed to land he thought he owned outright, only to discover that a second deed had been filed for the same parcel under a different name, with Crane's name buried in the fine print in a way that stripped him of his primary claim. He had lost his ranch, his cattle, most of his money. His wife had left him shortly after, taking their 2 daughters back to Missouri. Crane had tracked Cole Merritt across 3 territories over 2 years. There were warrants for Crane in Colorado for assault. A bartender in Tucson had given a description matching Crane to a deputy who had been asking about a man who had been asking about Cole Merritt. The timeline put Crane in the area south of Dodge City around the time of Cole's death. "You think Crane killed Cole?" Naomi said, looking up from the papers spread across the desk. "I think it is the most likely explanation for a horse throwing a man who knew horses on a road he knew well," Eli said. He was standing at the window now looking out at the street, which means Crane got what he came for, but Crane has been in this territory recently. A rancher named Bautista, 15 miles south of here, told my deputy 2 weeks ago that a man matching Crane's description had been asking about the Holt parcel. Naomi felt the cold settle into her spine. Why would he be asking about the land now? Cole is dead. Eli turned from the window. "Because the land is worth something," he said. "The creek that runs through that parcel feeds into the Rio Cimarron watershed. The territory has been negotiating water rights in connection with the coming railroad survey. Land with water access in this area is going to be worth 5 times what it is worth today in 3 years' time. Someone who knows that and wants that land now, before the survey is complete and the prices climb, has reason to clear the deed of any competing claims, which means clearing you." The word sat between them with quiet, terrible weight. "He would come after me," she said. "He might," Eli said. "Or he might try to contest the deed through legal means first. A deed with 3 names, and 1 fraudulent name, is vulnerable to challenge. If Crane has a lawyer in Santa Fe, and I believe he does, he may be attempting to tie the deed up in territorial court until the other claimants cannot maintain their standing." "How do I maintain my standing?" she asked. "By being here," he said. In person, willing to testify with a lawyer of your own. I do not have a lawyer of my own. There is one in Redrock. His name is Prescott. He is competent if not inspired. Eli paused. I would also suggest you not stay at the hotel alone. She looked at him. Are you suggesting I am in physical danger? I am suggesting that Aldous Crane is a man who has already, in my estimation, killed once for this land. I am suggesting you take reasonable precautions. He held her gaze steadily. Mrs. Kendrick, I am sorry for what my brother did to you and for the situation you are in. I cannot give you back the months you lost or the husband you thought you had, but I can try to make sure you come out of this with what is rightfully yours. She studied him for a long moment. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, gone golden and slanted through the window, catching the dust in the air and making it look almost beautiful. The office smelled of paper and gun, oil, and faintly of coffee from the pot on the stove that had gone cold. Why? She asked. Because my name is on your deed, he said. That is a legal reason, she said. I asked for a reason. Something shifted in his expression, not much, just enough. Because the right thing to do is occasionally not complicated, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will need to find somewhere to stay. Mrs. Delgado runs a boarding house on Cimarron Street, he said. She is a good woman and she is discreet. I will walk you over. They walked through Redrock's Main Street in the long late afternoon, the two of them side by side with the particular careful distance of two people who have just shared a significant truth and have not yet decided what to do with the intimacy that creates. Naomi carried her traveling bag. Eli carried nothing but his badge and whatever it was he was carrying inside himself, which she suspected was considerably heavier. The town noticed them. She could feel it, the way a town notices a stranger walking beside its marshal with the kind of focused, almost combative composure that tells anyone paying attention that this particular stranger has arrived with a purpose and intends to see it through. A man sitting in front of the barber shop tipped his hat. A woman hanging laundry on the side of the hotel watched them pass with undisguised curiosity. They are wondering who I am, Naomi said. They are wondering why you arrived on the Santa Fe stage with a land deed and went straight to my office, Eli said. Should I be concerned about the attention? In a town this size, strangers are always noted. Crane will know you are here within the day if he has eyes in Redrock, which I suspect he does. He glanced at her. That is not a reason to be afraid. It is a reason to be deliberate. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that she had been being deliberate for most of her life, had learned it in the hard school of a family that fell apart, and a world that did not wait for you to recover. She had not arrived in Redrock expecting to feel anything other than determined. And she was determined, but she was also, underneath the determination, considerably more shaken than she intended to show. Mrs. Delgado's boarding house was a long adobe building on a side street, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a garden in the back that was already showing the first green shoots of a spring planting. Mrs. Delgado herself was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and dark eyes that saw everything and commented on nothing that was not strictly her business. She gave Naomi a room on the second floor with a window that faced east and a good solid bolt on the door. Any trouble, you knock on my wall here, Mrs. Delgado said, rapping her knuckle on the shared wall between Naomi's room and the room next to it. My nephew Tomas sleeps there and he is a light sleeper. Thank you, Naomi said. Eli lingered in the doorway of the boarding house after Mrs. Delgado had gone back to her kitchen. He stood there in the early evening light with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, and Naomi thought that for a man who wore his authority so easily, he looked curiously uncertain. I will call on you in the morning, he said. I want to take you to see the parcel. She looked at him. The land. Your land, he said. Whatever is on that deed, the land was never Cole's. He did not buy it, and he did not build on it. It has been sitting empty for 3 years waiting for someone to claim it. You are the only person with a legitimate claim. She wanted to ask him what he had meant when he said he would make it right, whether that included withdrawing his own name from the deed. She wanted to ask him about the years before Redrock, about Lincoln County, about what a man did with himself when the world he grew up in taught him that law was a suggestion and honor was expensive. She did not ask any of those things. "In the morning," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked back out into the Redrock evening without looking back, and she watched him go from the boarding house doorway until he turned onto the main street and was gone. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of everything she did not yet know how to name. Then she stood up and unpacked her traveling bag with efficient, careful hands. The morning came bright and dry. The sky over the desert hills to the east, that particular shade of blue that only exists in the high country of New Mexico. A blue so clear and so immense that it had a way of making a person feel both very small and very aware of being alive. Naomi was up before the sun was fully over the hills, washed and dressed and sitting at the small table in her room with the copy of the land deed laid flat in front of her. She had read it 6 times by the time she heard Eli Dawson's knock on the boarding house door downstairs. She came down to find him in the entryway, speaking quietly with Mrs. Delgado. He had a horse for her, a steady bay mare from the livery stable, and his own horse, a big gray gelding, stood tied to the post outside. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hotel dining room across the street, and he handed her one without ceremony, and she took it and drank and felt some essential part of herself settle into the day. They rode south from town on the main track, then turned east on a wagon road that narrowed quickly to a trail as the town fell behind them. The country was beautiful in a way that made Naomi ache slightly, the kind of beauty that is specific and precise, red rock and sage and pale winter grass just beginning to go green at the roots, and above it all the enormous sky. A hawk turned on a thermal high above them. The sound of the horse's hooves on the dry ground was the loudest thing in the world. Eli rode beside her with his easy, unself-conscious horsemanship, and after a while he said, "You ride well." "I grew up on a farm in Kansas," she said, "before it was sold." He looked at her. My father's debt," she said. "The farm itself was fine until it was gone." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand something about that," he said. She did not press him on it. They rode in a silence that had changed from the guarded, careful silence of the previous afternoon into something less armed. The trail dropped down into a shallow valley, and she heard the water before she saw it, the quiet running sound of a creek moving over stones. The Holt parcel was 320 acres in the valley of a small creek that ran north toward the Cimarron. The land was not farmed and not fenced, but the grass in the valley bottom was thick and the water was clean, running clear over limestone rock. There were the remnants of a structure at the east end of the valley. Not much, just a squared foundation of stones and some weathered timber that had been the beginning of something, abandoned before it became anything. Naomi stood on the valley floor and turned slowly, taking in all 360 degrees of it. The creek ran past her with its clean, unhurried sound. The hills rose gently on either side, covered in juniper and pinyon pine. A pair of bluebirds shot past, impossibly bright in the morning light. "Someone started a house," she said, looking at the foundation stones. "Gerald Holt," Eli said. "The real one. He filed on this land in 1878, started building in 1879, went to work in the mine to get money for materials. He was in the mine when it collapsed." He paused. "He never had a family. No one came to claim the deed after he died." She walked slowly toward the old foundation. She crouched down and put her hand on one of the stones. It was warm already from the morning sun, warm and solid and absolutely indifferent to the human drama that had swirled around it. The stone did not know about Cole Merritt or Aldous Crane or the Railroad Survey or the water rights. The stone simply was. "I want to build here," she said. She had not meant to say it. It came out before she could decide whether to say it, came from somewhere below deliberation, from the part of her that had been looking for this place for years without knowing what it looked like. She looked up at Eli, who was standing a few feet away watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Then we need to make sure the deed is clean," he said. "And Crane is a problem I intend to handle," he said. She stood up. She looked at him directly, the way she had been looking at people directly since she was 15, and learned that looking away was more dangerous than looking at the thing you were afraid of. "I do not want to be a problem that gets handled," she said. "I want to be a person who handles her own problems. I did not come all this way to stand behind a marshal and wait." Something in his expression shifted, and then, for the first time since she had walked into his office, he smiled. It was not a large smile, not the kind that announces itself and demands acknowledgement. It was a quiet smile, the kind that happens in spite of a person rather than because of them. It changed his face considerably. "I believe you," he said. She looked at the valley around them. "What does Crane actually know about me?" she asked. "He knows Cole Merritt is dead. Does he know Cole married someone before he died?" "He may not," Eli said. He was thinking, she could see it, working through the angles with that methodical quality she had begun to recognize. "The marriage record is in Abilene. Crane has been following Cole's property trail, not his personal history. He may know there is a Kendrick on the deed but not know who Kendrick is." "That is an advantage," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Then let us use it before we lose it." She turned to look at him fully. "If Crane does not know who I am yet and you are already known to him as the marshal with your name on the deed, then the natural assumption is that you and I have some prior arrangement, some connection. It gives us a reason to be working together that does not require us to explain the full truth of the deed to anyone we are not ready to explain it to." He studied her. "You are suggesting we let people draw their own conclusions about our association." "I am suggesting," she said carefully, "that we not correct incorrect conclusions if incorrect conclusions are useful." She paused. "Is that a problem for you?" He held her gaze for a moment. The morning light made his eyes darker than they had looked in the office, a deep warm brown with something watchful in them. "No," he said, "it is not a problem." Lawyer Prescott turned out to be a thin, sandy-haired man in his mid-40s, with a precise and careful mind that did indeed inspire moderate rather than passionate confidence. But Naomi had dealt with cautious men before and understood how to get the most out of them. She sat across from him in his small office above the Assier's room and laid out the facts with precision, walking him through the deed, the fraudulent use of Gerald Holt's identity, Cole Merritt's marriage to her, and the presence of Aldous Crane in the territory. Prescott listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was done, he folded his hands and said, "The strongest argument for your claim is continuous intent. You entered the marriage with genuine belief in the legitimacy of the deed and genuine intention to occupy and improve the land. Merritt's fraud was perpetrated against you as well as against the territory. You are as much a victim as a party to the fraudulent filing." "What about Eli Dawson's name on the deed?" she asked. "The marshal will need to formally disclaim any interest in the parcel," Prescott said. "If he does so by sworn affidavit filed with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, his name ceases to be a competing claim and becomes instead a piece of evidence of Merritt's deceptive practices, which actually strengthens your case." He paused. "Has the marshal indicated his willingness to do this?" "He has," she said. Prescott nodded slowly. "Then your claim is defensible. The principal obstacle is Crane if he chooses to contest through the courts. His attorney would need to argue that the entire filing is void due to fraud, which would return the land to the territorial commons and leave it open for a new claim, at which point Crane could file his own claim. Can he do that? File a new claim on land he had no prior connection to?" "Technically, yes," Prescott said. "But the court would look with disfavor on a claimant who successfully voided an existing deed and then immediately filed on the same parcel. It would be, frankly, transparent." "Transparent to a court that is not corrupt," she said. Prescott looked at her. New Mexico territorial courts in 1883 are not what one might call pristine, he admitted. However, the land office reforms of 1880 have improved things somewhat, and a case with this level of documentation and a credible primary claimant would be difficult to subvert without leaving marks. She left Prescott's office with a clearer picture of the legal landscape and a new set of tasks. She needed to collect every piece of paper she had from the Abilene marriage, the deed copy, the justice of the peace record. She needed to write to the land office in Dodge City for the record of Cole Merritt's travel papers, which might help establish his true identity. She needed to be ready to stay in Redrock through whatever legal process followed. She found Eli at the end of his afternoon rounds, sitting on the bench outside the marshal's office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the main street with the particular quality of attention that did not look like attention, the unhurried gaze of a man who had learned to see everything from the corner of his eye. She sat down on the bench beside him and told him what Prescott had said about the affidavit. "I will have it drawn up tomorrow," he said. "You understand that removes you from the deed entirely." "That is the point," he said. She looked at him. "It means you get nothing." "I never wanted anything from that land," he said simply. "It was never mine. It was used as mine without my knowledge or consent. Removing myself from it cleanly is not a sacrifice. It is just correcting a record." She was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon was going golden again, the way it had the day before, and the main street of Redrock was doing its end-of-day things, the ranchers heading home, the saloon beginning to fill with the sound of voices and the faint and tinny sound of the piano that the barman's wife played on Friday evenings. Someone was cooking beans and chili somewhere nearby. The smell was deeply domestic and oddly comforting. "Tell me about Lincoln County," she said. He looked at her. There was a pause, not a defensive pause but a careful one, the pause of a man deciding how much truth he wants to put into an early evening conversation. "It was violent," he said. "It was the kind of violent that makes you understand what people are capable of on both sides of any line you try to draw. I was a deputy during the cattle war years. I saw things I do not care to have seen. I did some things I did not entirely like doing." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to Redrock because it was quieter, and because I thought if I could keep the peace in one small place and do it cleanly, it was worth more than whatever I had managed in Lincoln County." "Is it worth more?" He considered the question with a seriousness she found herself respecting. "Most days," he said. She found herself smiling just slightly. "Most days is not nothing," she said. He looked at her sidelong, and the quiet smile she had seen at the creek came back. "No," he said, "it is not nothing." The threat that Eli had been anticipating arrived sooner than either of them had hoped. 3 days after Naomi came to Redrock, Eli's deputy, a young man named Pete Vargas, came into the office at mid-morning to report that a rider had arrived at Bautista's ranch the previous evening asking about the current occupant of the Holt parcel. The description Bautista had sent by rider fit Aldous Crane: tall, heavy-set, close-cropped gray hair, a scar along the left jaw, a way of asking questions that made a person answer before they had decided to. He was riding with one other man, younger, whose name no one knew. Eli sent Pete back to Bautista's with instructions to keep an ear open and to send word immediately if Crane moved toward town. Then he went to the boarding house and told Naomi. She listened to him with the same still, concentrated attention she brought to everything, sitting at the small table in the boarding house parlor where Mrs. Delgado had put out coffee and cornbread, and then tactfully withdrawn. Naomi had a piece of paper in front of her where she had been writing a letter to the Abilene Justice of the Peace, requesting a certified copy of the marriage record. "How long do you think we have before he comes to town?" she asked. "A day, maybe 2, Eli said. "He is doing his reconnaissance carefully. That worries me more than if he were coming straight in." "A careful man is more dangerous than a reckless one," she agreed. "Yes." He sat down across from her. "There are 2 things we can do. One is to proceed legally as quickly as possible, and let the deed resolution be so clearly on record that any challenge becomes transparent and costly, as Prescott says. The other is to try to find evidence that links Crane directly to Cole's death, which would take his legal standing away entirely since a person cannot profit through land claims from a murder they committed. Do you have any such evidence? Not yet, he said, but I have a name. There was a man with Cole when he died, one of the men who found him, who gave a statement in Dodge City. His name was Walt Purvis. I have reason to believe Purvis has since been seen in New Mexico territory. If Purvis is working for Crane, and if I can find Purvis and get him to talk, the whole picture changes. She looked at the letter she had been writing. Then she set down the pen and folded her hands. You need to find Purvis, she said, which means you need to leave Redrock. Briefly, he said, Pete can manage here for a couple of days. She looked at him directly. I am coming with you. He opened his mouth. I know what you are going to say, she said. You are going to say it is dangerous. It may be, I am aware. But Purvis's testimony, if you get it, will be about me. The marriage, the deed, the death of the man I was married to. I have a right to be present for that conversation. And frankly, she added, with a precision that left no room for argument, if Purvis is the kind of man who talks more easily to a widow than a lawman, you need me there. Eli Dawson was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that acknowledged, without pleasure or resentment, that she had just made a point he could not defeat. You will stay behind me if there is any physical danger, he said. Gladly, she said. I have no interest in being heroic. I have an interest in keeping my land. They rode out the following morning, Naomi on the bay mare and Eli on the gray gelding, heading southwest toward a mining camp called Cerro Blanco, where Eli's informant, a Navajo trader named Hostian Nez, who traveled the trade routes between Redrock and the Rio Grande, had last seen a man matching Purvis's description 3 weeks prior. Hostian Nez was a man Eli trusted, had traded information with for 2 years in a relationship that was built on mutual respect, and the understanding that the peace of the territory benefited people on both sides of the arbitrary lines that kept being drawn across land that had been someone else's long before anyone drew any lines. The ride to Cerro Blanco took most of a day, through country that grew progressively more dramatic as they moved into the higher terrain southwest of Redrock. The mountains here were real mountains, stone-spined and juniper-cloaked, and full of the kind of silence that feels inhabited even when you cannot see what is inhabiting it. They rode mostly in the comfortable silence they had been building between them, punctuated by observations and questions that had nothing to do with deeds or dead men, that were simply two people finding out who the other one was. She told him about Mrs. Farnham and the dress shop in Abilene, about the wedding dresses she had made for other women, about the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from sewing the dreams of people whose lives are larger than your own. He told her about growing up in Texas with his mother, about learning to read from a woman who ran a lending library out of her saddlebag, riding between ranches. He told her about the first time he had worn a badge, how the weight of it had surprised him, not physically but in some other way he had never quite found the right words for. Like the badge itself understands what it means, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said, exactly like that. She had an odd moment of thinking. This is what it might feel like to have someone know what you mean. The thought surprised her enough that she looked away, out at the long slope of the mountain to the west, and did not pursue it. Cerro Blanco was a scrabble of tents and 3 permanent structures at the base of a white limestone ridge, home to perhaps 40 miners at any given time and the assorted personnel that followed miners. It smelled of wood smoke and mule and the sharp mineral smell of fresh rock. They arrived in the late afternoon, and Eli found Hostian Nez at the trading post set up on the east edge of the camp. Hostian Nez was a man in his 60s, lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes that moved with careful economy. He greeted Eli with the relaxed courtesy of established familiarity, and looked at Naomi with open but unhurried assessment. "Purvis left 3 days ago," he told Eli in clear, accented English that suggested he had learned the language late in life, and had learned it better than most people who had learned it first. He was nervous, asking about the Redrock road. He had new money, the kind that comes in a lump. "Which direction did he go?" Eli asked. "North toward the Cimarron," Nez said. "There is a man's camp near the river bend, where the old buffalo hunters used to winter. Someone has been there recently." Eli thanked him and bought a quantity of dried meat and cornmeal from the trading post, more than they needed for the ride back, and Naomi understood without asking that this was a customary way of paying for information in a currency that was respectful and practical. She added a length of good cotton cloth she had in her bag, a remnant from her old sewing life that she had been carrying out of habit, and set it on the counter without comment. Nez looked at it, and then looked at her, and nodded once. They camped that night in a hollow below the ridge, with a small fire and the dried meat and the sky overhead full of more stars than seemed strictly necessary. The desert night was cold even in April, and Naomi wrapped herself in the blanket she had brought with a practicality that nonetheless acknowledged the cold was real. Eli sat across the fire from her, and she was aware, in the quiet, of the quality of the distance between them. It was a careful distance, the kind that has been deliberately maintained. "Your brother," she said, "did you love him?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I wanted to," he said. "There was something in him that reminded me of my father in the way he moved, the way he laughed. I met him too late to know him properly. By the time we met, Cole was already too far down the road he had chosen." He paused. "I grieve the idea of him more than the person, if that makes sense." "It makes complete sense," she said quietly. "I do not know how to feel about his death. He lied to me. He used me. And then he died, and I was left with the consequences of his lying, and I never got to ask him why, never got to look him in the face and say, 'You did this to me.' I never got that." She looked at the fire. "That is the thing that stays, not the grief, the incompleteness of it." Eli Dawson looked at her across the fire, and his expression had that open quality of a man who is setting down something he has been carrying for a while. "When I found out he had used my name," he said, "I spent 2 weeks trying to figure out why. Whether it was spite or strategy or both. I think it was both. Cole knew I had gone into law. I think part of him resented that. Part of him wanted to drag my name into his work, to muddy it. To prove that the line between us was not as clean as I wanted it to be." "Did he succeed?" she asked. "Not in the way he intended," Eli said. He looked at her steadily. "The line between us is still clean. He just complicated it." She studied him across the fire. He was not a man who made himself easy to know. She understood that. He had the quality of someone who had learned to be self-sufficient in the deepest sense, not in the practical way of a person who can saddle a horse and shoot straight, but in the emotional sense of someone who had concluded, after sufficient evidence, that needing people was a risk that generally cost more than it paid. She recognized it because she had a version of the same quality in herself. She looked away, back at the fire, and said nothing more that night. But when she woke in the early hours before dawn, very cold, and found that Eli had added wood to the fire while she slept, she lay still for a moment in the warmth of it and felt something shift in the arrangement of things inside her chest. They found Walt Purvis the next afternoon. He was at the River Bend camp Hosty and Nez had described, a lean-to of cut pine boughs over a frame of branches, tucked against a cutbank where the Cimarron made a hard turn west. He was cooking over a small fire, and he heard them coming and stood up and reached for the rifle leaning against the cutbank. And Eli said calmly and clearly, "United States Marshal, Redrock District. Put the rifle down, Mr. Purvis." Purvis was perhaps 40, thin and sharp-featured, with the look of a man who had been making bad decisions for so long that he had forgotten the other kind existed. He looked at Eli's badge and at Naomi and at the rifle in his hand, and made a calculation that ended with the rifle going back against the cutbank. He talked. It took 2 hours and some firm pressure from Eli. Not violent, not threatening, simply the unrelenting kind of pressure that comes from a man who does not intend to leave without the truth and makes that clear without raising his voice. Purvis had been hired by Aldous Crane in Dodge City to locate Cole Merritt and, in Purvis's words, persuade him to relinquish any claims connected to the Crane Ranch in Colorado. The persuasion had become violent. Cole Merritt had not survived the persuasion. Purvis had panicked and left the scene, fabricated the horse story for the Dodge City sheriff, and been paid off by Crane to stay quiet and stay gone. He had not stayed gone enough. Naomi sat on a stone beside the river and listened to the whole of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still. The man she had married had been killed over land. Not her land, but land from a previous scheme. She had been in the entire ugly business, a tool used to establish a deed and then discarded. The man who had killed her husband, such as he was now circling her land and by extension her life. She felt the fury move through her in a long, slow wave, the way deep water moves, not dramatically but with enormous force. When Purvis finished talking, Eli looked at her. She gave him a single, precise nod. Eli handcuffed Purvis to the trunk of a nearby cottonwood with a length of rope, told him they would be back for him within 2 days, and left him with water and a sufficient quantity of food for the time. Then he and Naomi rode back toward Redrock at a pace that meant they arrived in the late evening, with the town already settling into its nighttime rhythms. Pete Vargas was waiting at the marshal's office with the news that Aldous Crane had arrived in Redrock that afternoon and taken a room at the hotel. Naomi went to the boarding house and Eli went to write his reports and send a telegram to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe, formally reporting Purvis's testimony and requesting authorization to arrest Crane on the charge of murder in connection with the death of the man known as Cole Merritt. The authorization came back by telegram the following morning. Eli arrested Aldous Crane at the hotel dining room at 8 o'clock in the morning, while Crane was eating breakfast. He made the arrest with the same quality of composed, unhurried authority that he brought to everything, and Crane, who was a man accustomed to other kinds of power but not quite this kind, sat very still and let the handcuffs be put on him without making the scene worse than it needed to be. Naomi was not there for the arrest. She was in Prescott's office, going over the affidavit that Eli had already signed the previous evening, the formal disclaimer of any interest in the Holt parcel, notarized and signed, and ready to be sent to Santa Fe. She was reading it carefully, making sure every word was right, when Pete Vargas knocked on the door to tell her that Crane had been arrested and was in the jail and the whole thing was over. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Pete," in a perfectly steady voice, and went back to reading the affidavit. The legal process that followed took 3 weeks. Prescott was thorough, and Purvis's testimony, once it was formally transcribed and sworn, was damning enough that Crane's lawyer, who had indeed arrived from Santa Fe, had very little room to maneuver. The land contest case was stayed pending the outcome of the murder charges. The deed was referred to the Territorial Land Court with Prescott's full brief and Eli's affidavit, and Naomi's sworn testimony about the circumstances of her marriage. During those 3 weeks, a kind of steady, ordinary life established itself around the extraordinary situation. Naomi ate breakfast at the hotel dining room most mornings. Eli fell into the habit of joining her for coffee most mornings on his way back from the early rounds. They sat across from each other and talked about things that were sometimes relevant to the deed case and sometimes not. They talked about books. They talked about the railroad survey and what it would mean for the territory. They talked about the families in Redrock, the history of the town, the Mexican land grants that predated everything else. Eli told her about the Navajo families to the west who had been through the horror of the Long Walk in 1864 and had returned to their traditional lands and were trying to rebuild what had been taken from them. And the way he said it made clear that he understood this injustice not as a historical fact to be noted, but as a present wrong that required ongoing attention. She liked him for that. She liked him for a great many things, and the accumulation of those things was becoming, in the privacy of her own thinking, a problem she was beginning to understand she was going to have to address. She had not come to Redrock for romance. She had come for land. Land was still the thing she wanted, with the clear, uncomplicated desire she had carried for years. She still stood at the Holt parcel, which she had begun privately thinking of as the Kendrick parcel, and felt the particular rightness of it, the creek and the valley and the old foundation stones waiting for something to be built on them. But there was Eli Dawson, sitting across from her in the hotel dining room with his second cup of coffee, and his quiet attention, and his way of listening as though what she said mattered in a way that was not performance but simply true. There was the fact that when they rode out to the parcel together, which they did twice more during those weeks, he looked at the land not as the marshal with a legal stake in its resolution, but as a man who understood what it meant to her. There was the fact that when Prescott brought the first good news from Santa Fe, that the territorial court had upheld the filing on the basis of her continuous intent, the first person she wanted to tell was Eli, and when she did tell him, standing in the doorway of his office, the look on his face was something she carried around with her for the rest of the day. He was careful with her. That was the word she kept coming back to. He was careful in the way of someone who understood that she had been handled carelessly by the world and had decided, without making a production of the decision, to be different. She was in Prescott's office when the final ruling came. The Territorial Land Court, in a decision dated the 22nd of April, 1883, affirmed Naomi Kendrick's claim to the 320-acre parcel described in the original Holt filing, on the grounds of legitimate intent, continuous claim through the legal marriage recorded in Abilene in September of 1882, and the sworn disclaimer of the third named party. The fraudulent filing of Gerald Holt's identity was noted for the record. The estate of Cole Merritt, which amounted to very little, was flagged for any creditor claims. Aldous Crane's legal challenge was dismissed pending the outcome of the criminal case against him. The land was hers. Prescott shook her hand with something approaching genuine warmth. She thanked him. She walked out of his office into the Redrock afternoon and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, with the sun on her face and the smell of sage coming in from the desert and the sound of the town going about its business around her. Then she went to find Eli. He was behind his desk when she walked in, writing a report with the steady, unhurried hand of a man who had made peace with paperwork as the less glamorous half of law enforcement. He looked up when she came in, and before she could say anything, he read it in her face. He stood up. "The ruling came," she said. "In your favor," he said. It was not a question. "In my favor," she confirmed. He crossed the room toward her, and she had a moment of not knowing what was going to happen next, a moment of pure uncertainty that was not unpleasant, that was in fact the most electrically alive she had felt in years. He stopped an arm's length from her and held out his hand, formal and serious. She took it. His hand was warm and very solid, and he held hers with the careful, deliberate grip of someone who was aware of exactly what he was doing. He said, "Congratulations, Miss Kendrick. The land is yours." She looked at their joined hands and then up at his face, and the thing she had been managing for 3 weeks was right there, not hidden at all, and she suspected by the quality of his expression that hers was equally transparent. "Naomi," she said, "just Naomi." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eli." She smiled. He smiled. They stood in the marshal's office in Redrock, New Mexico, in the spring of 1883, holding hands in the entirely practical and not at all practical aftermath of a land deed dispute, and the feeling between them was as clear and clean and full of possibility as the creek running through the valley 15 miles south. She did not kiss him that day. That is not how it happened. What happened was she went back to the boarding house and sat on her bed and thought about the fact that she had a piece of land and no house on it and no equipment and no money beyond what she had saved in Dodge City, which was enough for materials but not for labor. And she had a plan forming in her head that was entirely her own and entirely realistic, and required her to stay in Redrock for the foreseeable future. And she thought about the fact that staying in Redrock for the foreseeable future had become, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, something that felt less like a legal obligation and more like the thing she wanted to do. She thought about Eli Dawson's careful, steady hands. She thought about the smile he had given her at the creek, the first time she had seen it. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Farnham in Abilene. She asked about the possibility of Mrs. Farnham sending down her sewing machine, a second-hand Singer that she had left in storage when she departed for New Mexico, along with her good shears and the box of notions she had carefully assembled over 3 years in the dress shop. She wrote that she intended to establish herself in Redrock and could use the machine. Then she went to find the man in town who did construction work, a Mexican craftsman named Felipe Ortiz who had built half the adobe buildings in Redrock and had a reputation for work that was both beautiful and durable. And she sat down with him and his eldest son and talked about what she wanted to build in the valley on the creek. When she told Eli about the construction plans, he was quiet in that particular way he had when he was thinking through multiple things simultaneously. "You are going to need someone to help you get the materials south," he said finally. "The wagon road to the parcel is rough. You will need 2 wagons for the lumber and stone." "I know," she said. "I have Saturday free," he said. She looked at him. "You are going to drive a lumber wagon for me." "I will drive the marshal's wagon," he said, "which is the territory's wagon and not strictly mine, but is available for legitimate civic purposes. And I will ask Pete if he wants to make $1 on his day off to drive the second." She thought about telling him he did not have to do that. She thought about it for exactly the length of time it took to understand that he wanted to do it, and that allowing people to do what they wanted to do for reasons she would rather not examine too closely was not weakness. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," he said. They worked alongside each other on the Kendrick parcel on the first Saturday in May, with Felipe Ortiz and his son and Pete Vargas and 2 other men from town who had come along out of the particular communal impulse that Western people have toward useful work. They unloaded lumber and laid the foundation for a proper wooden house on the old stone base that the original Gerald Holt had left behind. Naomi worked beside them with the competence of someone who has always known that there is no work beneath her, carrying boards and mixing the mortar for the stone foundation, and making sandwiches at midday from the food she had brought wrapped in cloth. Eli worked without ceremony, in shirt sleeves in the warm May sun, and he was very good with his hands, which she had suspected but was glad to have confirmed. He did not direct the construction. That was Felipe's domain, but he was useful in the way that a person is useful when they simply pay attention to what is needed and provide it. At the end of the day, when the foundation was laid and the first floor framing had been sketched in, they sat on the valley floor with cold water from the creek and the last of the sandwiches, and the long light of a May evening making everything gold. Pete Vargas was talking to Felipe's son about something funny involving a mule. The other 2 men were packing tools back into the wagon. Eli sat beside Naomi on a flat stone by the creek, and the distance between them had narrowed without either of them having moved deliberately toward the other, the way distances narrow when 2 people have been doing honest work together for 10 hours. "It is a good piece of land," Eli said. "Yes," she said. "You are going to be happy here," he said. She looked at him. "I think so," she said. And then, because she had always been direct, "Are you going to visit?" He looked at her with a quality of attention that had shed its careful distance. "Regularly," he said. She felt the warmth of that word move through her in a way that had nothing to do with the May evening. "Good," she said. He did visit. Regularly, as promised, and with an increasing frequency that Redrock noted and commented on with the gentle, relentless interest that small towns apply to the romantic possibilities of their public figures. By June, when the Kendrick house was framed and roofed and beginning to look like something that had always been there, Eli was riding out to the parcel on Sunday afternoons and staying for supper and riding back in the dark. By July, when the sewing machine arrived from Abilene and Naomi set up a small seamstress business in one of the rooms of the still unfinished house, doing work for the women of Redrock who were very pleased to have a skilled dressmaker within 15 miles rather than 100, Eli was coming on both Saturday and Sunday. They were not yet what a person would call openly courting, or at least they were not calling it that. They were two people who had been brought together by a complicated and painful situation, and had discovered that the situation, once resolved, had left behind something neither of them had expected. The first time he kissed her was in July, on a Sunday evening when she had walked him to where his horse was tied at the bottom of the valley. The evening was warm and smelled of sage, and the creek ran its steady musical argument over the stones below them. He had been holding her hand for 3 weeks in the casual way that had begun as formal courtesy and become something else entirely. He stopped walking, which made her stop too, and he turned to face her, and his expression had that quality of a man who has decided to put down the careful management of something and simply let it be what it is. He said her name, just her name. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment at the touch of it, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a careful, deliberate, utterly honest kiss, the kind that does not perform its own tenderness but simply has it. And when they pulled back and looked at each other in the long July evening, Naomi understood that she was in love with Eli Dawson in the way that is not a decision but a discovery, the way you discover a creek running through a valley, something that was there all along and that you simply had not yet arrived at. He was looking at her with an expression that made her chest ache with something that was not pain. "I should have told you earlier," he said, "that I have been falling in love with you since the day you walked into my office and read my brother's name on your deed and did not shout." She laughed, which surprised them both. "I wanted to shout," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still glad you did not." She kissed him again, this time with her hands in his collar, and he held her with his large, careful, honest hands, and the creek ran below them, and the evening star came up over the ridge to the east. Aldous Crane was tried in the territorial court in Albuquerque in September of 1883, with Walt Purvis as the principal witness for the prosecution and a territorial prosecutor who had, for once, been assigned to a case he could actually win. Crane was convicted of the murder of Cole Merritt, known also as Gerald Holt, and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. His lawyer appealed immediately, as lawyers do, but the verdict held. Naomi had traveled to Albuquerque for the trial, not because she was required to, but because she had needed to sit in that courtroom and hear the verdict and feel the specific completion of a thing that had been left incomplete for almost a year. Eli had gone with her. They had sat in the gallery together, and she had kept her face very still through most of it, and only when the verdict was read did she allow herself to exhale in a way that contained everything she had been holding since she stood over a grave in Dodge City, trying to understand what had been done to her. Eli's hand had found hers in the gallery at the moment of the verdict, and she had held it with a grip that acknowledged what the word guilty actually meant to her. They ate supper at the best restaurant in Albuquerque that evening, which was not very grand by the standards of the eastern cities, but was excellent by territorial standards, with good beef and fresh bread, and wine that had been brought up from a vineyard in the Rio Grande Valley. They talked about the trial, and about what came after, and about nothing consequential, and the ease between them was the ease of people who have already decided on the important things. On the ride back to Redrock 2 days later, Eli said, somewhere in the high country between Albuquerque and the Cimarron watershed, in the middle of the afternoon, with the mountains around them and the sky above them and everything very still and very large, I want to ask you something." She looked at him, riding beside her on the gray gelding. He was not looking at her but at the road ahead, and his jaw had that particular set that she had learned to recognize as the external sign of internal commitment. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her then, his dark eyes in the afternoon light. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not for a deed, not for land, not for any practical reason whatsoever. Just because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life riding to that valley and being let in." She felt the whole of her history rearranging itself around this moment. The farm in Kansas, the boarding house in Topeka, the dress shop in Abilene, the stage ride west, the grave in Dodge City, the land deed in a marshal's office in Redrock, the creek running over limestone stones. All of it, every step of it, rearranging itself from a series of losses and difficulties and survivals into the particular, precise path that had led to here, to this man on this road in this light. "Yes," she said, "just because of that, yes." They were married in Redrock in October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Cole Merritt's death on the road outside of Dodge City. The marriage was performed by the minister at the Redrock Church, with Pete Vargas and Mrs. Delgado and Felipe Ortiz and Hostian Nez, who had ridden in from the Cerro Blanco trading routes for the occasion, as witnesses. Naomi wore a dress she had made herself, a dark blue wool with ivory trim, and she had cut the pattern and sewn every seam and pressed every edge herself, because it seemed right that the dress she married Eli Dawson in should be the work of her own hands. He wore his good suit, which Pete had persuaded him to press, and he had gotten his hair cut for the occasion, and when she walked down the church aisle toward him and saw his face, which was the face of a man who could not believe his own luck and was not trying to hide it, she thought she had never been so glad of anything in her life as she was of having kept her composure in a marshal's office one afternoon in April and not shouted. The celebration afterward was the whole town, essentially, gathered in the church hall that Mrs. Delgado and several other women had decorated with dried flowers and colored cloth. There was a fiddle and a guitar and dancing that went on until well past midnight. Naomi danced with Eli and she danced with Pete, and she danced with Felipe's son and once, briefly and sweetly, with Mrs. Delgado, who danced with surprising vigor for a woman of her years, and whispered in Naomi's ear that she had known, from the first evening she had bolted Naomi's room door, that the marshal was going to be trouble. Naomi had laughed until she cried briefly into Mrs. Delgado's shoulder. They moved into the Kendrick house on the creek the following week, the house that was now, legally and actually, and in every sense that mattered, the Dawson house on the Kendrick parcel, though Naomi kept both names on the deed because the land had been hers before it was anyone else's, and she did not see any reason to change that. Eli agreed with a completeness that told her she had chosen well. The house was finished by then, with 3 rooms and a proper kitchen and a front porch that looked north toward the creek and the hills beyond, and a back room that was Naomi's sewing room, with the Singer machine from Abilene on a good table by the east window, where the morning light came in clean and strong. She had her shears hung on the wall and her notions organized in the wooden box, and a steady flow of work from the women of Redrock, who were very pleased with her work, and had begun sending word to friends in other towns. Eli rode into Redrock every morning for his rounds and rode back in the evening, and on days when there was nothing that required a marshal's presence, he worked on the land with his hands, the way he liked to work, building a fence along the south meadow, improving the wagon road to town, doing the 1,001 things that a piece of land requires. He was good at all of it, with a quiet, steady competence that Naomi found deeply restful. They had their arguments, of course. They were 2 people with strong opinions and hard-won habits, and the kind of inner resourcefulness that can make it difficult to yield. They argued about the fence line, about a financial decision involving the sale of grazing rights to a neighboring rancher, about a particular case Eli was working in the winter of 1883 that he was being more secretive about than Naomi felt was warranted. But the arguments were clean, the way arguments between people who fundamentally trust each other can be clean, and they resolved with the completeness of people who have both decided that being right is less important than being together. In the spring of 1884, Naomi discovered she was pregnant. She told Eli on a Sunday evening on the porch, with the first warm wind of spring coming up from the south and the creek audible below them, and his reaction was the one she had hoped for without quite letting herself hope for it. He was very still for a moment, in the way he was still when something large moved through him, and then he turned to her with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that she felt her eyes go warm. He put his hand against her face gently and said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am entirely all right." He said her name again, the way he had said it that July evening before he kissed her for the first time, as though her name itself were something he wanted to hold carefully. She covered his hand with hers. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the creek, with a midwife from Redrock in attendance and Eli present, which was not entirely conventional for the period, but which Naomi had informed him was going to be the case, and which he had accepted without argument. The birth was difficult and long and exhausting in the way that first births are, but the midwife was skilled and the baby was healthy, and when Naomi finally held him, wrapped in the blanket she had knitted during the autumn months, she felt a wholeness so complete that it seemed to contain every earlier incompleteness and resolve it. They named him Thomas, for Naomi's father who had been flawed and had nonetheless been her father. She had not entirely forgiven Thomas Kendrick for the farm or the debt, or the long succession of choices that had made his daughters' lives harder than they needed to be. But she had come, over the years and particularly in the last one, to understand that people were what they were and love was what you made of the complicated material available to you. She named her son Thomas and chose to let that be a forward-facing thing rather than a backward-looking one. Eli held Thomas with the enormous, careful tenderness of a man who has strong hands and knows how to use them gently, and he looked down at his son with an expression of such profound and transparent love that Naomi, watching from the pillow where she was resting, felt her heart turn over. Pete Vargas became the nearest thing Thomas had to an uncle, present at the house on the creek, with an enthusiastic regularity that required minimal encouragement. Mrs. Delgado came for Sunday dinner most weeks through the winter and spring, and her cornbread became Thomas's first solid food in the summer of 1885, a fact she was very proud of. Hosty and Nez came by the following autumn, traveling with a small group of Navajo traders on the southern route, and spent 2 nights at the house on the creek. He brought Thomas a gift, a small wooden horse carved with a precision and beauty that made Naomi catch her breath. She thanked him in the careful, respectful way she had learned, and Eli translated the part of the exchange that required translation, and afterward she thought about the breadth of what this land and this place contained, the layered histories of people who had each had their own versions of the ongoing fight to hold on to something. In the spring of 1886, Naomi was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, or at least more familiar. Thomas, who was now a walking, talking, endlessly curious person of 17 months, was supervised during the birth by Eli and the midwife simultaneously, which resulted in a considerable quantity of creative distraction involving horses and a wooden spoon, and a song that Pete Vargas had taught him about a mule named Barnabas. Their second child was a girl. They named her Margaret for Naomi's mother, who had held Naomi's hand in a boarding house in Topeka and told her to be braver than the circumstances. Eli held Margaret in the first moments of her life with the same enormous care he had held Thomas, and he looked at Naomi over the baby's head and said, with a simplicity and completeness that required no elaboration, "We have everything." She looked at him, at his dark eyes and his careful hands, and the man he was who had sat down across from her in a chair in an office in Redrock on an afternoon in April 3 years ago, and decided to be honest with her when honesty was the harder thing. She looked at the house they had built on the old foundation in the valley, where the creek ran over limestone stones. She looked at her sewing room with the morning light coming through the east window. She looked at the land, visible through the bedroom window, the grass going green in the long, warm twilight of a New Mexico spring. She thought about how she had been looking for solid ground her whole life, for something that stayed, and how she had come to understand that the thing that stayed was not the land itself, though the land was real and beautiful, and hers in a way that still filled her with quiet satisfaction every time she walked it. The thing that stayed was this. The thing she had not been looking for and had found anyway. This man and these children and this life on this particular piece of the earth. "We do," she said. Thomas came in from the main room at that moment, escaping his father's supervision and arriving at the bedside with the single-minded urgency of a child who needs to see the new thing immediately. He peered at his sister with enormous eyes and said, with the confidence of a boy who considers himself the authority on most matters, "Small." "She will grow," Naomi said. He considered this. "Like me?" "Exactly like you," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and climbed up to sit beside her on the bed, which he was technically not supposed to do, and Eli made a sound that was not quite laughter and lifted him up anyway. And there the four of them were, in the bedroom of the house on the Kendrick parcel on the creek in the high country of New Mexico, in the spring of 1886. The Territorial Railroad Survey was completed that year, and the value of water access land in the Cimarron watershed increased substantially, exactly as Eli had predicted. Naomi received 2 separate offers for the parcel, both of them very substantial sums of money from land speculators who had come in behind the railroad survey. She declined both offers without particular difficulty. The land was not for sale. Crane was still in the territorial prison. His appeal had been denied in 1884. Walt Purvis had taken a deal for reduced charges in exchange for his testimony, and had, as far as anyone in Redrock knew, gone to work on a sheep ranch in Arizona and made no further trouble. The ghost of Cole Merritt, who had never been Gerald Holt and had briefly been Naomi's husband, receded further with each year until he was simply a dark thing that had happened on the way to something better, the way dark things sometimes are. Eli was elected marshal again in 1886 by the citizens of Redrock, who had developed the easy confidence in him that comes from watching a man do a difficult job cleanly and without drama for several years. He was, the town generally agreed, the best marshal they had ever had, which was partly because he was skilled and partly because the law he practiced was the kind that was genuinely about peace and not about power, which is rarer than it should be. He came home to the creek every evening, and in the lamplight of the kitchen he and Naomi talked about the day, about the children, about the land, about the books that came by mail order from Albuquerque, and that they read in the evenings after the children were asleep. The two of them on opposite ends of the sofa that Naomi had reupholstered in good green wool, with their feet occasionally tangled together in the comfortable, unpretentious way of people who have stopped performing for each other. On Sunday mornings in the summer, they took the children to the creek, and Thomas, who was growing long and solemn and frequently covered in mud, built elaborate stone dams that Eli helped design with the seriousness of an engineer. Margaret, who proved to be a person of very strong opinions from an early age, supervised both of them with a critical eye that made Naomi laugh and made Eli say, with an expression of mock concern, that she was going to be the most formidable woman in New Mexico by the time she was 20. "Good," Naomi said. "The territory will need formidable women." He looked at her with that smile she had fallen in love with, the quiet one that happened in spite of him, and she thought that some things in this world are exactly what they appear to be. Not hidden, not trapped, not secret, just true and good and worth every step it costs to arrive at them. The Kendrick parcel on the creek in the high country of New Mexico was her land and her home and the ground she had been looking for since she was 15 years old, and the world went unsteady beneath her feet. The man beside her was the man who had handed her a deed with his own name on it and sat down at her level and told her the truth. The children sleeping in the house behind them were the proof that something real had been built on a foundation that had once belonged to a man who never got to finish what he started. She leaned her shoulder against Eli's arm in the Sunday morning light, with the sound of the creek and the sound of Thomas's dam building and the sound of Margaret's supervisory commentary filling the warm New Mexico air, and she felt the ground beneath her, solid and real and staying. It stayed. It always stayed. And so did they.